The deputy held the paper away from his body, as if the ink might stain him. Inside the cabin, the stove roared so hard the lids ticked against the iron, and heat pooled along the rafters where meltwater dripped onto a quilt. But near the door, a wash basin had grown a skin of ice. A boy sat on the floor with his bare toes tucked under a flour sack, and his sister stood behind the stove clutching a school slate, watching the man in the doorway who would not step inside. The woman asked whether the paper gave the creditor her stove, too. The deputy looked at the children. He did not answer quickly. Matthias Brecke died on the 14th of October, 1887, when a threshing belt snapped on the Lindgren claim 4 miles east of Morrow Crossing and drove an iron hook through his ribs. He lived long enough for a neighbor to bring him home in the back of a buckboard, long enough for Marit to press her hands against the wound and feel the warmth leaving him in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Long enough for 8-year-old Eli to stand in the doorway holding her brother's hand, watching her mother kneel in blood-soaked straw. Not long enough for Matthias to say what he had planned for the 16 cords of wood they did not yet have, or the wall that was still half chinked, or the stove payment due in December. He was 34 years old. The doctor arrived 2 hours after he stopped breathing. Marit buried him on the south side of the claim, where the wind would not pile snow against the marker. The ground was still soft enough to dig. It would not be soft much longer. She counted what remained. $38 in coin kept in a tin beneath a floorboard, 1 3/4 cords of cottonwood and ash, split but not seasoned, stacked against the east wall of a shanty that measured 16 feet by 20. 2 children, Eli, 8, with a cough that had started in September and had not stopped. Amos, 5, who asked every morning when his father was coming back from the Lindgren place. 1 iron cook stove, a No. 9 box model bought on credit from Burton Pike Supply Yard in Morrow Crossing, with $14 still owed on it. And the shanty itself, half finished, half chinked, roofed in sod and tar paper, with a storm door that was just a plan Matthias had drawn on the back of an envelope. The nearest relatives were in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Passage east would cost more than the $38. Walking away meant abandoning the claim, the improvements, the 5 years of residence Matthias had begun proving up. The Homestead Act did not care that a woman's husband had died. It cared that someone lived on the land and worked it. Marit's name was on the filing now. There was nowhere else to go and no money to get there. Winter on the eastern Dakota prairie did not arrive. It descended. The first hard frost came on the 29th of October, 2 weeks after the funeral. By the second week of November, the temperature had not climbed above freezing in 6 days. The wind came from the northwest without anything between it and the Arctic but grass stubble and the curve of the earth. And the stove ate air. Marit did not understand the problem at first. She understood cold. She had grown up in a timber cabin outside Decorah, Iowa, where her father, Torgrim Hogan, had built walls thick enough to hold warmth through a February night. She understood fire. She could bank coals, manage a damper, stretch a cord of green cottonwood longer than most men thought possible. What she did not understand, not yet, was that her stove was not just making heat. It was consuming the room to do it. The iron box sat near the center of the shanty on a pad of flat stones Matthias had laid. When the firebox was loaded and the damper opened, the stove roared. The lids trembled. The stovetop glowed in a ring around the firebox seam. Heat climbed toward the rafters and pooled there, warming the sod roof until meltwater sometimes dripped onto the bed. At shoulder height, the cabin was bearable. At waist height, cool. At the floor, where Amos slept on a straw tick and Eli curled with her blanket pulled over her head, the cold was something else entirely. It was not the absence of warmth. It was movement, a current, a river of freezing air that slid across the floorboards from every crack, every gap in the chinking, every place where the wall met the foundation logs. The stove pulled that air. Every pound of wood it burned required air to burn it, and the stove took that air from the only place available, the room. What left through the chimney had to be replaced by what came through the walls. The hotter the fire, the harder the pull. The harder the pull, the colder the floor. Marit moved the children's bed to the center of the room. The draft followed. She stuffed rags into the worst cracks. The stove smoked because she had sealed its air supply. She pulled the rags out. The draft returned. She was losing, and she did not yet know why. Rufus Calder arrived on a Tuesday in mid-November, riding a gray mare with a toolbox roped behind the saddle. He was 58 years old, lean and wind-scoured, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he spent his life shaping. Rufus had built more claim shanties around Morrow Crossing than any man alive, and he had sold stoves for Burton Pike before a disagreement about credit terms ended that arrangement. He knew cabins. He knew heat. He knew what killed people. He did not knock. He pushed the door open, stamped snow from his boots, and stood in the center of Marit's cabin with his arms crossed, looking at the walls the way a doctor looks at a patient he expects to lose. "You have half a wall sealed," Rufus said. He ran his thumb along the east chinking where Matthias had stopped work. The gap between two logs was wide enough to slide a finger through. "That is not chinking. That is a suggestion." Marit said nothing. She stood by the stove with the poker in her hand. Rufus walked the room. He pressed his palm flat against the north wall and held it there. He crouched and put his hand near the floor. He looked at the woodpile visible through the open door, the 1 3/4 cords stacked against the east wall outside. "Green cottonwood," he said. "Some ash. Maybe a 1/4 cord of the ash is dry enough to burn clean." He stood and brushed his knees. "You need 6 cords minimum to see April, 7 if January comes in hard. You have a stove too large for a room this loose, and it will be too hungry for a room sealed tight. You need another layer of tar paper on the north wall, a proper storm door, and new chinking from the sill to the plate. And you need a man to cut through February." "I do not have a man," Marit said. "I know that." Rufus looked at the stove. The lids were trembling with the draft. The firebox was loaded with cottonwood splits that hissed and spat because the wood was still half green. "How much money?" $38. Rufus did the math out loud, not to be cruel, but because he believed in numbers the way some men believed in scripture. "Cordwood from Pike's yard is $4.50 a cord at winter rate. 6 cords is $27. Tar paper is $1.10 a roll. You need 4 rolls. Chinking clay you can dig if it is not frozen yet. Storm door lumber is $3 for my scrap pile. Call it a favor. That leaves you $4 for food, lamp oil, and the stove payment you owe Pike in December." He let the numbers sit. Then he said, "Mrs. Brecka, I built this shanty with your husband. It was meant to be finished by November. It is not finished. You cannot finish it alone, heat it alone, and feed 2 children through a Dakota winter on $38 and green wood." "What do you suggest?" Marit asked. "Sell the improvements to someone who can winter here. Take what you get. Go east." "The claim is in my name." "The claim is not worth your children." Marit held the poker so tight her knuckles whitened. She did not argue. She asked him a question instead. "When you put your hand on the floor," she said, "what did you feel?" Rufus frowned. "Cold." "Moving cold," Marit said, moving toward the stove. Rufus waved his hand. "That is draft. Every cabin has it. A stove needs air. Air comes through the walls. Seal it tighter, you get smoke. It is just how stoves work." "And if a stove did not work that way?" Rufus pulled his gloves on. "Then it would not be a stove, Mrs. Brecka. It would be a dream." He touched his hat and left. Marit watched him ride out through the door crack. Then she crouched by the stove and opened the ash door 1 finger's width. The draft across her ankle sharpened, a blade of cold air racing along the floorboard. She closed the ash door. The draft eased, but the fire dimmed, and smoke leaked from the lid seam in a gray thread. She held a candle near the windowsill. The flame bent inward toward the stove, pulled by the same hunger that pulled the winter through the walls. That night, Amos woke crying because his hands were numb. Marit pulled him into her bed and wrapped her body around him, and the stove glowed red in the dark, and the floor breathed cold, and somewhere in the wall a mouse scratched at chinking that was not there. She lay awake until the fire needed feeding. Then she rose, loaded the box, opened the damper, and felt the floor draft sharpen against her bare feet like a punishment for wanting warmth. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a sound. 3 days after Rufus left, Marit woke before dawn to the fire gulping, not crackling, not popping. Gulping, a rhythmic pull of air through the ash grate that sounded almost like breathing. She lay still and listened. The sound came in waves, matching the wind gusts that pressed against the north wall. Every gust tightened the cabin. Every tightening made the stove pull harder through the cracks. The stove and the wind were working together, and the cabin was caught between them. She got up and opened the ash door a finger's width. The gulping stopped because the stove had what it wanted: air coming straight through the open door. The floor draft near the bed weakened. Eli stopped coughing for the first time that night. Then smoke curled from the lid seam. The angle was wrong. The ash door was pulling air too fast across the grate, and the firebox was losing its draw upward. Marit shut the door. The gulping resumed. The floor draft returned. Too little air was dangerous. Too much air, from the wrong direction, was also dangerous. The stove needed air, but it needed air delivered on terms that did not empty the room. She sat on the floor beside the stove in the dark. The iron was warm against her back. The floorboards were cold against her legs. 2 temperatures, 2 worlds, separated by 3 feet of height, and the invisible river of air that connected every crack in the wall to the mouth of the firebox. And she remembered her father. Torgrim Haugen had not been a stove man. He had been a tile man. In Wisconsin, before Marit was old enough to understand why, he had spent 3 seasons laying clay drainage tile through marshland that other men said could not be drained. She remembered a specific afternoon, summer, rain coming sideways, her father kneeling in a trench that came up to his chest. Water trembled at the bottom. He was pressing clay around the bell joint of a 6-inch tile, his hands steady despite the rain, his forearms slicked brown to the elbows. He had held her hand near the pipe mouth. She could not have been more than 7. "Feel that," he had said. She felt it, a cool movement, invisible, like the creek was breathing through the clay. "Water, smoke, and air," Torgrim had said. "They all take the easiest road. A leak is just a road you did not mean to build." Marit stared at the stove in the dark. The fire needed air. The air was taking the road through the walls because no one had given it a better one. What if someone did? She found Matthias's pencil in the kitchen box and flattened Burton Pike's latest payment notice on the stovetop, using the warm iron as a desk. She drew while the children slept, a line from the woodshed, the leeward wall, sheltered from the worst wind, down into a trench, 2 feet deep, maybe deeper. Clay tile. 6-inch bore, the same kind her father had laid in Wisconsin, running underground beneath the frost, where the earth would temper the air before it ever reached the stove. 70 feet, maybe more. Under the cabin floor, up into an iron box fitted beneath the ash grate, a sliding gate so she could control how much the fire drank. She drew the slope, falling away from the stove so condensation would drain back toward the intake, not pool in the pipe. She drew a wire screen at the woodshed mouth to keep mice out, a clean-out point at the lowest elbow where she could rod the pipe if it clogged, a clay collar where the tile met the iron box, packed tight but not mortared, so it could be broken and resealed if the stove needed service. The drawing looked like a drainage system aimed at a cook stove, because that was exactly what it was. Give the fire its own road. Stop making the room pay for combustion with its warmth. She stared at the drawing until the fire needed feeding again. Then she folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket, and loaded the stove. The draft across the floor sharpened. Amos turned in his sleep. Eli coughed. The idea was logical. The idea was also insane. To build it, she would need clay tile. At least 29 sections, maybe more if breakage ran high. She would need iron scraps for the intake box and the sliding gate. She would need to dig a trench 70 feet long and 2 feet deep through ground that was freezing harder every day. And she would need to do it while feeding the stove, feeding the children, cutting what wood she could from deadfall along the creek, and making the December payment to Burton Pike. The risk was not just failure, it was the cost of failure. Every dollar spent on tile was a dollar not spent on cordwood. Every hour spent digging was an hour not spent cutting. Every calorie burned in the trench was a calorie not keeping her alive. If the idea did not work, if the pipe froze, or the draft reversed, or the seal failed, or the fire smoked, she would enter the worst of winter with less money, less wood, less strength, and a useless trench. She did not sleep again that night. Alma Kittredge arrived the next afternoon with a pot of bean soup and a look on her face that said the soup was not the reason she had walked a mile and a half in the wind. Alma was 39, built square, with hands as rough as Rufus Calder's and none of his patience for conversation. She had 5 children, a husband who hauled freight between Morro Crossing and Huron, and the nearest claim to Maritz, a full quarter section with a cabin twice the size of the Brecka shanty, and a woodpile that would have made Rufus nod with something close to approval. Alma was not unkind. She was practical in the way that survival on the Dakota prairie made people practical, which meant she measured help against cost and spent sympathy the way she spent flour sur passeron, in amounts she could afford. She set the soup on the stovetop and watched Marit unfold the drawing. "What is that?" Alma asked. Marit explained. Woodshed intake. Clay pipe underground. Gentle slope. Wire screen. Clean out at the elbow. Iron box under the ash grate. Sliding gate. Alma listened with her arms folded. When Marit finished, Alma said, "You want to bury a chimney." "Not a chimney, an air road." "You want to dig 70 feet of trench and ground that will be frozen by the end of the month." "The ground is not frozen yet, not all of it." Alma picked up Amos, who was pulling at her skirt, and set him on the bed without looking away from Marit. "You have 2 children. You have no wood to spare. You have $14 owed on that stove and a man in town who would love to take it back, and you want to spend what little money and strength you have left on burying pipe in the dirt. I want to stop the stove from pulling winter through my walls. You cannot eat an idea, Marit. You cannot burn a trench." Marit did not argue. She asked Alma to stand barefoot near the door. Alma gave her a look that could have frozen the soup, but she unlaced her boots and stood on the cold floorboards in her stockings. "Feel that," Marit said. "I feel the floor. It is cold. Floors are cold." Marit opened the ash door a finger's width. Alma's expression changed. "That is the stove pulling," Marit said. "Every crack in the wall feeds it. Every board in the floor carries it." She took a scrap of stovepipe, a short section left over from the chimney installation Nasarbi, and held one end near the gap under the door while aiming the other toward the ash grate. The fire steadied. The floor draft near the bed weakened. Alma looked down at her feet. "Now," Marit said, and pulled the pipe away. The draft returned. The flame in the firebox lurched. Alma put her boots back on. She stood for a long time looking at the stove, then at the drawing, then at Marit. "A trick in a room is not a winter plan," Alma said. "You showed me something with a piece of pipe. That is not 70 feet of clay and frozen ground." "No," Marit said, "it is not. And if you are wrong, you will have spent your last strength on a hole." "Yes." Alma picked up the empty soup pot. At the door she turned back. "Your girl's cough is worse." "I know." "The floor is killing her." "I know that too." Alma left. The door closed. The stove gulped. The floor draft sharpened against Marit's ankles, and she stood there holding a scrap of stovepipe that proved something no one else believed. Burton Pike's woodyard sat at the west end of Morro Crossing's single street, between the livery and the creek. Pike was 46, thick-shouldered, with a voice that carried across the yard even when he was not trying to be heard. He sold cordwood, lumber, nails, stove parts, and credit. The credit was the profitable part. A settler who could not pay cash for winter wood could buy on account at Pike's rate, which was 40% above cash price, secured against claim improvements. If the settler failed to pay, Pike acquired the improvements. And sometimes the claim itself, through arrangements that were legal, if not generous. Pike had held paper on Matthias Breca's stove and nail account since August. $14 remained. The December payment was $6. Marit had $38. After the payment, she would have 32. After cordwood at Pike's winter rate, she would have nothing. After nothing, Pike would have a claim. Marit walked to Morrow Crossing on a Thursday morning with Matthias's old hand auger over her shoulder and a question she already knew the answer to. She did not go to Pike's yard first. She went to the freight depot, where rejected shipments sometimes accumulated, and asked about broken drainage tile. The depot clerk remembered a failed order, 40 sections of 6-inch clay tile meant for a drainage project south of Morrow Crossing that had been abandoned when the buyer moved to Oregon. 29 sections remained. Some were cracked. Some were chipped at the bell. None were perfect. The clerk wanted $1 for the lot. Marit did not have $1 she could spare, and $1 she could not spare at the same time. She traded Matthias's silver watch chain, the only piece of him she carried that had value beyond memory, and the clerk added 2 cracked elbows to the pile. Then she went to Pike's yard. The yard was busy. 3 men waited for cordwood loads. Rufus Calder stood at the nail bins counting 16-penny spikes into a sack. A freight driver named Len Bostwick leaned against a wagon wheel, smoking. Marit asked Pike for scrap iron. She needed pieces large enough to fabricate an intake box and a sliding gate for her stove. Pike had a barrel of scrap behind the office, broken stove parts, bent strap iron, cracked lid plates. He would sell her what she needed for $2. Pike looked at her with the patience of a man who understood leverage. "What do you need stove iron for, Mrs. Brecky? That number 9 works fine." "I am fitting an air intake." "An air intake." Pike leaned against the counter. He was smiling in a way that was not a smile. "To bring air in from where?" "From outside, through clay pipe, underground." The yard went quiet. Rufus looked up from his nails. Len Bostwick stopped smoking. Pike said, "You're burying pipe. Clay pipe, like you mean to drain a swamp." "Drainage tile," Marit said. 6-inch bore, 72 feet from the shed wall to the stove belly, falling 2 inches end to end. Rufus set down his nail sack. "A chimney goes up, Mrs. Brecka," he said. "Only a widow with no man left to stop her would bury one in the dirt." Pike laughed, not softly, the kind of laugh that was meant to carry, and it did. Len Bostwick grinned. One of the cordwood men shook his head. Pike said, "Then call it a dirt chimney." Marit looked at Pike. She looked at Rufus. She looked at the freight driver and the cordwood men who were watching her the way people watch someone say something foolish in a place where foolishness is remembered. She said, $2 for the scrap iron." Pike took her money. He counted it into his box. Then he said, loud enough for the yard to hear, "Men with teams and 6-cord wood piles cannot keep a cabin warm in a Dakota blow, Mrs. Brecka. And you think you're going to do it with flower pot pipe." Marit did not answer. She loaded the iron scraps into a sack, balanced the sack over the auger on her shoulder, and walked out of Pike's yard. Behind her she heard Len Bostwick say, "Dirt chimney," in a voice that was already shaping the phrase into a joke that would survive the winter. The phrase spread the way everything spread in a place with 40 families and 1 street, completely within days. Dirt chimney moved from Pike's yard to the general store to the schoolhouse steps. Children said it to each other without knowing what it meant. The freight driver who hauled Marit's tile from the depot asked if she was planting stovepipe like seed corn. A woman Marit did not know stopped her outside the dry goods counter and said kindly, "My husband says you should save your strength for cutting wood, Mrs. Brecka." Someone left a dead mole on the trench line. That was not kind at all. The mockery was not savage. It was the ordinary cruelty of people who believed they were being practical. Marit looked to them like a desperate woman spending strength she could not spare on an idea that contradicted everything they knew about stoves, chimneys, and the direction air was supposed to travel. A chimney goes up. Everyone knew that. A woman who buries one in the dirt is a woman who has lost her way. Alma came again, not with soup this time, with a warning. "Pike has been asking who would buy the bricky improvements if you cannot make the December payment," Alma said. She stood in the doorway without coming in, as if entering would make her complicit. He's not asking because he's curious. I know what Pike is doing, Merritt said. Then you know he benefits if you fail. Every hour you spend digging that trench is an hour you are not hauling his cordwood. He likes that. He likes you in the ground. I will be in the ground either way if the stove keeps drinking the room. Alma shook her head. I hope you are right about that pipe, Merritt, but I will not tell you that I think you are. She left. The door closed. The wind pressed against the north wall, and somewhere inside it, the stove gulped and the floor breathed, and Merritt sat down with Matthias's pencil and counted the things she had left. 29 tiles, 2 cracked elbows, a sack of scrap iron, an auger, a spade, a mattock, a broken grain shovel. $32 minus $6 for the December payment, minus whatever food and lamp oil costs between now and the day the ground froze so hard that digging stopped forever. She could not afford to be right slowly. She could not afford to be wrong at all. She started digging the next morning before the sun cleared the eastern flat. The trench ran from the leeward wall of the woodshed, the south side partially sheltered from the northwest wind by the shed's own bulk, toward the cabin. She marked the line with twine and willow pegs driven into the half-frozen ground. The route was not straight. It curved to avoid a rock ledge that Matthias had complained about when setting the cabin foundation, then ran under the crawl space between the cabin's sill logs and the ground. She started with the spade. The topsoil was frozen to a depth of 4 inches, a crust that cracked like pottery when the blade hit it right and refused to break when it did not. Below the crust, the earth was stiff but not yet stone. She could dig. It cost her. The first day, she opened 9 feet of trench, 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide. Her palms split before noon. She wrapped them in strips torn from a flour sack and kept cutting. By afternoon, her shoulders burned and her lower back had locked into a cramp that would not release until she lay flat on the cabin floor after dark. 9 feet open, 63 to go. She fed the children corn mush in the morning and saved the milk for them. She ate what was left in the pot after they finished. She loaded the stove twice before leaving for the trench, and once when she came in at midday to warm her hands and check on Eli, whose cough had settled into a rhythm, 4 barks, a pause, 4 barks, a wheeze. The second day, she opened 7 more feet. The ground was harder. The mattock rang against clay that was thick with small stones. Each swing sent a shock up her forearms. 16 feet total, 56 to go. Progress became a count she carried in her body. 22 feet by the end of the 4th day. Her skirt hem froze stiff every morning and did not thaw until she came inside. Her knuckles cracked and bled into the clay. She ate less so the children could eat more, and the difference showed in her face within a week. Cheekbones sharper, eyes set deeper, the cords in her neck visible when she swung the mattock. 31 feet by the end of the first week, 41 to go. 3 tiles laid in the open section, bedded on scraped earth, joints unpacked because she was not yet sure how to seal them properly. The tiles sat in the trench like bones in an open wound, and every night she dreamed about water and slope and the hollow sound a pipe makes when the air moves through it. On the 9th day, a man stopped beside the trench and did not laugh. Oddmund Vangen was 64 years old, Norwegian-born, with a stiff left leg from a quarry accident and hands that remembered every tile they had ever laid. He had come to Dakota 8 years ago, after his wife died, and lived in a sod dugout 2 miles north of Morrow Crossing, where he kept 3 goats and a temperament that discouraged visitors. He had laid culverts for the railroad. He had built drainage systems for farms in Minnesota and Wisconsin. He had set more clay tile in more frozen ground than any man Merritt would ever meet. He stood at the edge of the trench for a full minute without speaking. Then he lowered himself down on his good leg, knelt on the stiff one, and tapped the nearest tile with his knuckle. The sound was clean, a hard ring that meant the tile was intact, not cracked beneath the glaze. He looked at the slope. He looked at the direction. He looked at the trench walls, which were rough but straight. Then he looked up at Merritt, who was standing above him with the mattock in her hands, and clay on her face, and blood on her flour sack wraps. "Who taught you to think in slope?" Oddmund asked. "My father," Torgrim Haugen. He laid tile in Wisconsin. Oddmund said something in Norwegian that Marit did not entirely catch, something about Haugen being a name he had heard in connection with marsh drainage near Black River Falls. Then he switched to English because the children were watching from the cabin door. "Your bedding is wrong," he said. "The tile sits on flat ground. It should sit in a cradle, a shallow curve scraped into the earth so the weight rests evenly. Flat bedding cracks tile when the frost heaves." He pulled himself out of the trench, walked to Marit's spade, and picked it up without asking. Then he got back into the trench and began scraping the bottom into a shallow, even curve beneath the first tile. "I did not ask for help," Marit said. "I did not offer help," Oddmund said. "I corrected a mistake. If you want me to leave, say so." Marit watched him work. His hands were precise. His stiff leg angled to one side, braced against the trench wall. The spade moved in short, even strokes that left the cradle smooth. "Stay," she said. Oddmund stayed. "Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building?" Marit had not proven anything yet, but for the first time, a man with scarred hands and a quarryman's bad leg had looked at her trench and seen a plan instead of a mistake. That afternoon, Oddmund taught the first lesson, trench shoring. He showed Marit how to brace the sidewalls with scrap boards, short lengths driven at an angle into the frozen crust above, leaning against the trench face. "Frozen ground looks solid," he said. "It is not. The crust can shear when the sun warms one side and the shade holds the other. A wall falls on you in this trench, and your children find you in the morning." He drove a board into place with the flat of the mattock. The board bit into the frozen earth and held. "How many of these?" Marit asked. "One every 4 feet on the side that faces south. The sun hits it. The crust weakens first there." They worked until the light failed. Oddmund showed her how to scrape each cradle to the same depth by using a stick cut to length as a gauge. He showed her how to check slope by pouring a cup of water at the high end and watching it run. If it pooled, the grade was wrong. If it ran too fast, the grade was too steep and the tile would shift. At dark, Marit brought him coffee. They stood at the edge of the trench and looked at 12 feet of properly bedded tile, glowing faintly in the last light. "A stove is a strange thing to aim a culvert at," Oddmund said. "A stove is a culvert with fire at the end," Marit replied. She did not know if she believed it yet, but she believed the floor draft. She believed the candle flame bending toward the firebox. She believed the sound of the stove gulping air in the dark. Oddmund looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Tomorrow I will show you how to seal the joints." He walked home in the dark, favoring his left leg, and Marit stood by the trench alone. The wind was picking up. The temperature was dropping. 31 feet of trench open. 41 to go. November was half gone. The ground was freezing harder every night. She went inside. The stove was nearly out. She loaded it, opened the damper, and felt the floor draft rise against her shins like a tide coming in. The buried pipe was still a drawing, a trench, and a dozen tiles in the ground. It was not a system. It was not proven. It was not anything except the most dangerous gamble a woman with 2 children and $32 could make on the frozen edge of a Dakota winter. But the stove gulped, and the floor breathed cold, and Eli coughed in her sleep. 4 barks and a wheeze, 4 barks and a wheeze, while the frost crept along the floorboard toward the place where her blanket touched the ground. Marit sat on the bed and listened. Somewhere beneath the cabin, in the dark earth that was freezing shut around her, there was a road the fire did not know about yet. She would build it, or she would run out of time trying. There was no third option left. Oddmund came back the next morning carrying a burlap sack of tools and a jar of rendered lard. The tools were for the pipe. The lard was for Marit's hands. "You cannot dig with open skin," he said, setting the jar on the stovetop to soften. "Infection takes a hand faster than frostbite. Grease them before you wrap them." Marit greased her palms, rewrapped them with fresh flour sack strips, and followed him to the trench. The second lesson was joint sealing. Odman mixed a paste of puddled clay, chopped straw, and a handful of wood ash in a bucket, working it with his hands until it held together like bread dough. He knelt in the trench, his stiff leg braced sideways against the wall, and pressed the paste around the bell joint of the first two tiles. He worked it with his thumbs, smoothing the outside, but he left the lower inside lip of the joint clear. "Why?" Marit asked. "Condensation," Odman said. "Warm air meets cold pipe, moisture forms. If you seal the inside lip, water pools backward into the joint below. Pools freeze, ice cracks tile. Leave the lip open and the water follows the slope out toward the intake." He sealed 3 joints in 20 minutes, each one identical. Then he handed her the bucket and watched her do the 4th. "Too thick on top," he said. "The pipe will settle and the cap of clay will break away. Thinner. Press harder." She did it again. He nodded once. They worked in a rhythm that first week. Marit dug the forward section of trench each morning, extending the line toward the cabin, breaking through ground that hardened by a 1/4 inch every night. Odman followed behind, scraping cradles, bedding tile, sealing joints. He could not dig. His leg would not allow the full swing of a mattock, but his hands could do what hers could not yet do, and his eyes could read slope the way a carpenter reads a level. By the end of the second week of work, they had 44 feet of trench open and 31 tiles laid, bedded, and sealed. The progress was real. So was the cost. Marit's weight was dropping. Her meals had shrunk to corn mush in the morning, nothing at midday, and whatever the children left in the pot at supper. Eli noticed. She started leaving food in her bowl, pushing it toward her mother with a look that was too old for 8 years. Marit ate it because she could not afford the argument or the calories to refuse. Her shoulders ached in a way that sleep did not fix. Her lower back seized every morning when she swung her legs off the bed, and the first 10 minutes of digging were agony until the muscles loosened enough to function. Her right thumb had split along the nail from gripping the mattock in cold, and the split would not close because she could not stop using the hand. 44 feet open, 28 to go, 14 tiles waiting to be laid, 4 weeks until January. 3.5 cords of wood now. She had added to the pile by dragging deadfall from the creek bottom during the hours Odman worked the trench alone, but 3.5 cords was still less than half of what Rufus said she needed. The stove kept gulping, the floor kept breathing, Eli kept coughing. On the 3rd week, the thaw came. It arrived on a Wednesday, a strange, warm wind from the southwest that raised the temperature above freezing for the first time in 12 days. Snow softened on the south-facing walls. Water ran in the wheel ruts along the section road. Men in Morrow Crossing stepped outside without coats and said the worst might be over. The thaw turned the trench bottom to paste. Marit came out at dawn and found 6 inches of standing water in the lowest section. The clay paste Odman had used to seal the joints was softening. 2 tiles had shifted, not much, a 1/4 inch, but enough to break the seal at one joint. Muddy water seeped through the gap and pooled in the pipe bore. She stood at the edge of the trench with the spade in her hands and understood for the first time that the ground could defeat her as surely as the cold. Odmund arrived an hour later and said nothing for a full minute. Then he got into the trench, water over his boot tops, and began scooping mud with a tin cup. "Bale first," he said. "Then reset the shifted tile. Then reseal. Do not panic about the water. Water in a trench is normal. Water in a sealed pipe is a failure." They baled for 2 hours. Marit's skirt was soaked to the waist. Her boots filled. The mud sucked at her feet with every step. Odmund worked on his knees, his stiff leg jutting behind him at an angle that looked painful and probably was. By noon, the shifted tiles were reset, the broken joints resealed, and a gravel sump, a pocket of creek stones at the lowest point of the run, was installed so future water would collect in a place that could be drained instead of spreading through the pipe. "Your father would have done this from the start," Odmund said, wringing brown water from his glove. "My father worked in summer." Excuses sound the same in every season. That night, the temperature dropped again. Hard. The thaw water froze in the trench. The reset joints held because the clay had been pressed deep into the bell before the freeze. But the 6 feet of trench Marit had not yet tiled were now locked under a sheet of ice that would need to be broken with the mattock before she could dig further. She lost 2 days to the freeze, 2 days she did not have. Rufus Calder came back on a Sunday. He did not ride to the cabin. He rode to the trench. He sat on his mare and looked down at the pipe. 44 feet of sealed clay tile, running in a gentle curve from the woodshed toward the cabin, bedded in scraped cradles, joint-sealed, gravel-sumped, shored with angled boards on the south face. "Vangen is helping you," Rufus said. It was not a question. "Oddman knows tile," Marit said. She was breaking ice in the forward section with short, controlled swings of the mattock. Each swing jarred her wrists. Each chip of ice exposed another inch of half-frozen earth. "Oddman knows culverts," Rufus said. "This is a stove." Oddman was not there. He had gone back to his dugout to feed his goats. But his work was visible in every joint, every cradle, every gravel pocket. Rufus saw it. He knew craftsmanship when it was in front of him, even if he did not agree with its purpose. "A culvert carries water to where you want it," Rufus said. "What do you think you were carrying?" "Air," Marit said, "to where the fire needs it." "The fire does not need you to dig a ditch. The fire needs wood. You need wood. Your children need wood." He pointed at the woodpile, which had grown to 3.5 cords, but still looked small against the shanty wall. "Every hour you spend in this ground is an hour you're not cutting." "Every hour I spend cutting wood for a stove that drinks the room is an hour wasted twice," Marit said. "The wood burns. The heat rises. The stove pulls cold through the floor to replace what it burned. I am feeding a machine that feeds the winter." Rufus stared at her. "That is a fine way to describe how stoves work, Mrs. Brecka. It does not change the fact that stoves work that way. It does if you give the fire another road." Rufus shook his head. He turned the mare and rode back toward Morrow Crossing. At the section road, he stopped and called back, "I hope Vangen knows more than I think he does." It was not encouragement, but it was not mockery either. It was the sound of a man whose certainty had been scratched, even if it had not cracked. The December payment came due. Marit walked to Morrow Crossing and put $6 in Burton Pike's hand. He counted the coins twice, wrote a receipt, and leaned across the counter. "You have $8 remaining on the stove and nails," Pike said. "Due February 1st. If you cannot pay, I take back the stove and credit the account. Your choice." "I will pay in February." "With what? You have been in a ditch for 3 weeks instead of hauling wood. You have no crop to sell. You have no husband to hire out. What exactly do you intend to pay with?" "I intend to survive the winter," Marit said. "That is what I intend to pay with." Pike smiled. The smile had teeth in it. "Mrs. Brecky, I have watched men with 40-cord woodpiles and stone foundations lose everything in a hard January. You have a hole in the ground aimed at a stove you cannot afford. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to be clear. You are trying to buy my claim." The smile disappeared. Pike straightened. He had the look of a man who had been seen through a wall he thought was solid. "I am trying to run a business," he said. "What you do with your claim is your affair, but February comes whether you dig or not." Marit left the yard with $8 of debt, $26 in her tin, and 72 feet of trench that was 58 feet open, 44 feet tiled, and 14 feet from the cabin. The ground was freezing harder every day. She had weeks, maybe less. Oddman taught the 3rd lesson on a morning so cold that Marit's breath froze on her scarf before it left her lips. They were working under the cabin now. The crawl space between the sill logs and the ground, a gap of 18 inches that forced Marit onto her belly with a candle stub and a trowel. The iron and clay intake box was Oddman's design. He fabricated it from scrap iron Marit had bought at Pike's yard, a broken stove lid cut and bent into a rectangular box, open at the bottom where the tile would connect and open at the top where the ash grate sat. The sliding gate was a piece of strap iron filed smooth that could be pushed in or out to control the airflow. "This is where the system lives or dies," Odmund said. He was lying on his side in the crawl space beside Marit, his stiff leg angled behind him, his face close to the stove's underside. "Too much air in the fire overfires. The iron heats past what it can hold. I have seen stove collars glow white. A white-hot collar can light a floor joist." "So the gate stays partly closed." "The gate stays where the fire tells you. A steady yellow burn with no smoke at the lids means the gate is right. Blue at the base means you are overfeeding. Dark orange means you are starving it. You will learn the colors." They sealed the box to the tile with a collar of clay, ash, and stove cement, a mixture Odmund made from slaked lime clay and iron filings. The seal was not permanent. It could be broken and rebuilt if the stove needed service or the pipe needed cleaning, but it was tight enough to keep air moving through the system instead of leaking into the crawl space. The fourth lesson was the clean-out. Odmund insisted on a removable tile section at the lowest point of the run, beneath a boxed plank cover that could be lifted from outside the cabin. He made Marit cut a willow rod 6 feet long, flexible enough to push around the curve, but stiff enough to clear a blockage. "What would block it?" Marit asked. "Everything. Mice. Frost. Your own ceiling clay if you packed a joint too tight. Leaves. Dirt. Ice. Anything the wind pushes through the screen, anything the ground pushes up through a cracked tile." He handed her the willow rod. "This is not a tool you keep in the shed. This is a tool you keep by the door." Marit took the rod and leaned it against the wall inside the cabin, beside the stove poker. They finished the undercabin connection on a Thursday. The pipe ran from the woodshed intake, sheltered by a slanted plank hood, wire mesh screen, and a burlap flap that could be lifted from inside the shed, through 72 feet of buried clay tile under the crawl space, and into the iron and clay box beneath the ash grate. The system was complete. The system was untested, and the calendar said December 29th. Marit lit the stove the next morning with the sliding gate open for the first time. The fire caught on birch bark and kindling. She fed it a split of dry ash. The flame rose, steadied, and turned a color she had not seen before, a clean, even yellow with no dark pulsing at the base. The lids did not smoke. The stovetop heated evenly. The sound was different, too. Not the gulping. A steady draw, like breath through a long throat. She held a candle by the floor crack near the door. In the old setup, before the pipe, before any of this, the flame bent hard toward the stove whenever the ash door opened. The stove pulled from the room, and the room pulled from outside. Now, with the gate open and the buried pipe feeding the firebox from beneath, the candle flame trembled but did not lean. The draft across the floorboard was still there. No cabin on the Dakota prairie was tight enough to eliminate floor cold entirely, but the hard, knife-edged current that had pulled freezing air across Amos's blanket was gone. The stove was drinking from the pipe instead of from the room. Marit boiled water. In a hard north wind, the kettle had taken 15 minutes. She watched the clock on the shelf, a tin wind-up that Matthias had bought in Huron. The kettle sang in 9 minutes. She marked a mercury thermometer borrowed from the school teacher and hung it at floor height near Amos's bed. She would check it every morning and every night. The numbers were hers to keep. Eli noticed first. She woke on the second morning of the pipe system and said, "My feet are not cold." Marit knelt and pressed her hand to the floorboard near Eli's bed. It was not warm, but it was not the biting cold that had crept along the grain all winter. The difference was the absence of the draft. The stove was no longer pulling winter across the children's blankets. Amos did not say anything. He just stopped sleeping with his hands tucked inside his shirt. The early tests were not perfect. On the third day, a northwest gust drove snow against the woodshed intake. The screen caught most of it, but fine powder sifted through and dampened the airflow. The flame darkened slightly. Marit lifted the burlap flap inside the shed and brushed the screen clean. The fire recovered. She made a note. Check the intake every time the wind shifts. On the 5th day, the temperature dropped to 14 below. The pipe performed. The stove burned steady. The floor stayed bearable. Marit calculated her wood consumption against the old rate and found she was burning roughly a third less. Not because the fire was smaller, because the fire was not fighting itself, not pulling cold air across the room to replace what it sent up the chimney, not cycling heat out through the same walls it had just warmed. But the skeptics were not convinced by mild weather. Rufus Calder stopped by in early January. He checked the stove. He felt the floor. He admitted the draft was reduced. Then he said, 14 below is not a test. A Dakota blow is a test. Ask me what I think after the wind comes. Pike was more direct. He told a customer at his woodyard that the first ground blizzard would pack that pipe mouth with snow and smother the fire. Then she will be burning her furniture and begging for cordwood at my rate. Alma said she hoped Marit was right. She said it the way people say they hope a sick animal recovers, with fondness and no expectation. Odman said nothing about the skeptics. He came every third day to check joints, test the gate, and tap tiles. He insisted on a hood modification, a wider slant on the plank cover over the intake, so drifting snow would slide off instead of packing against the mesh. He made her build a second clean-out rod, longer than the first, for reaching the elbow joint from the woodshed end. He was not satisfied. He was preparing. You built a road, Odman said on the 10th of January, standing in Marit's doorway with his coat frosted white. Now you must learn to keep it open. January 12th, 1888, began as a lie. The morning was mild, absurdly mild. The temperature hovered near freezing, and sunlight came through the cabin window at an angle that felt like late March. Snow softened on the south wall. Water dripped from the eaves. Marit hung laundry on the line for the first time since October. Eli went to school without her heavy wrap. Amos stayed home because his boots were drying by the stove. Marit walked to the woodshed to inventory what remained, 4 1/4 cords now, more than she had started with in November, thanks to the pipe system's reduced burn rate and the deadfall she had dragged from the creek. At 10 in the morning, she noticed the chimney smoke flatten, not rise and bend, flatten, press sideways against the roof like a hand had shoved it. Odmund was in the doorway. He had walked over that morning to check the intake hood, and he was standing with one hand on the frame, looking northwest. That is not ordinary wind, he said. The sky changed, not gradually, the way weather usually changed on the prairie. The northwestern horizon darkened in a line that looked like a wall of earth had been lifted and thrown forward. The temperature began to fall, not in the slow descent of a winter evening, in the way a stone falls, constant, accelerating, irrevocable. Marit looked at the school, which was 1.5 miles northeast. Eli was at the school. She was tying rope around her waist when Alma Kittredge's oldest boy, Tomas, came around the corner of the woodshed. He was 14, tall for his age, and he was pulling a clothesline. Behind him, tied wrist to wrist, stumbled Eli, 2 smaller children from the neighboring doll claim, and a boy Marit did not recognize. The teacher tied us together, Tomas said. His face was white, not pale. White, the way skin looks when blood has left it. She said, follow the smoke. We lost the road at the creek. We followed your chimney. The wind hit while the children were still coming through the door. It did not build. It arrived. A sound like canvas ripping, multiplied by 1,000, and then the world outside the window disappeared. Not dimmed, disappeared. The barn, 40 feet away, was gone. The woodshed, 12 feet from the cabin wall, was a gray smear and then nothing. Snow moved sideways so thick and so fast that breathing required turning away from the wind and cupping a hand over the mouth. The temperature was dropping and would continue to drop. By afternoon, it would reach 20 below. By evening, 30. By midnight, the wind chill would push it toward 50 below, and any exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Marit had 6 children in a 16 by 20 foot room, 1 stove, 1 buried air pipe, and a storm that could pack snow into any opening faster than she could clear it. She closed the door. She checked the stove. The fire was burning. The sliding gate was open. The flame was yellow and steady. The pipe was feeding. "Everyone on the bed," she said. "Boots off, under the blankets. Tomas, stack the boots by the stove. Eli, hold your brother." The children moved. They were not calm. Two of the doll children were crying. The boy she did not recognize had wet himself. Eli was coughing. The old cough, the four-bark rhythm, worsened by the run through the wind. But they moved because Marit's voice carried the kind of authority that comes from having spent 2 months digging in frozen ground toward a thing no one else believed in. The first hour passed. The stove held. The room held. The floor was cold but not lethal. The children nearest the center of the bed stopped shivering. The kettle boiled. Marit made corn mush and divided it into 6 bowls, and the children ate because warmth and food together could quiet even terror. Oddman sat by the stove with his stiff legs stretched toward the heat. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Listen." Marit listened. The stove was drawing. The sound was the steady breath sound she had learned to recognize. Air moving through the buried pipe, tempered by earth, feeding the firebox from below. The wind screamed outside, the walls shuddered, but the stove was steady. "It is working," Marit said. "It is working now," Oddman said. "The intake is clear now." The second hour, the flame darkened. It happened slowly. The yellow shifted toward orange. The steady draw sound thinned. Smoke feathered from the front lid seam, a single gray thread that curled upward and thickened as Marit watched. The pipe was choking. Snow was packing against the intake hood. The mesh screen, even sheltered inside the woodshed, was catching fine powder driven sideways through the shed's plank walls. The burlap flap had frozen. The air supply was narrowing. Marit checked the clean-out inside the cabin. She pressed her ear to the boxed cover and heard only a weak hiss where there should have been a steady rush. The pipe was not blocked, not fully, but the flow was dropping. Pike's prediction was coming true. The first ground blizzard, and the pipe mouth was packing with snow. "I have to clear the intake," Marit said. Oddman looked at the door. The door was shaking in its frame. Snow was sifting through the gap between the boards, building a small white ridge on the floor. "Not alone," he said. "You cannot walk in this. Your leg. Then tie yourself and take the rod." If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because this is the moment when Marit's buried pipe stopped being an idea and became the only thing standing between 6 children and the storm outside. Marit tied Matthias's hemp rope around her waist. She knotted the other end to the stove leg, the heaviest anchor in the room. She took the willow clean-out rod. She put on Matthias's coat, his mittens, his hat. She pulled the scarf over her face until only her eyes showed. She opened the door and the storm tried to take her off her feet. The wind was not air moving. It was a physical thing, a weight, a wall, a force that pressed against her chest and took her breath. She could not see, not reduced visibility, no visibility. The woodshed was 12 feet from the cabin door. She found it by feel, one hand on the rope, the other on the cabin wall, sliding along the logs until she reached the corner, then across the gap, counting steps. 4 steps. 5. Her boot hit the shed wall. She followed it to the door. Inside the woodshed, the wind was reduced but not gone. Snow had found every crack between the planks and turned the interior into a white haze. The intake hood was visible only because she knew where it was. She knelt and found the mesh screen. It was packed solid. Not just snow, compressed snow, driven into the mesh by wind pressure until it formed a plug as dense as bread dough. The burlap flap behind the screen was frozen stiff, a sheet of ice cloth that would not move. She broke the plug with the willow rod. She stabbed it, twisted it, pulled chunks of packed snow away from the mesh. The rod was not enough. She pulled off Matthias's right mitten and dug with her bare fingers. The snow burned, then numbed, then something worse than numb, a stiffness that meant the skin was starting to freeze. She cleared the screen. Air moved. She could hear it. A hollow rush through the pipe, the sound of the road opening again. She pushed the burlap aside and wedged the willow rod behind it to hold it clear. Her right hand touched the iron frame of the mesh screen and stuck. frozen skin on frozen iron. The oldest cruelty of winter on the plains. She pulled. The skin tore. Not much. A strip across 2 knuckles, raw and red beneath. She felt nothing. She would feel it later. She tied the burlap back with a loop of twine, replaced the mitten over her bleeding hand, and followed the rope back to the cabin. The 12 feet to the door took longer coming back than going out. The wind had shifted. She was walking against it now, leaning forward, pulling herself along the rope, hand over hand, while the snow tried to fill her lungs. She came through the door. Oddman closed it behind her. She knelt by the stove and listened. The steady draw was back. The flame was rising, yellow returning, the lid smoke clearing. Eli was watching from the bed. Her cough had quieted. She said, "Mama, your hand." Marit looked at the blood on her mitten. "It is nothing," she said. "The fire has its road again." The storm ran for 31 hours. During that time, Marit cleared the intake 3 more times. Each time, the plug was smaller. She had learned to wedge the burlap and rod at an angle that deflected the worst of the snow away from the mesh. But each time still required the rope, the walk, the bare handwork in conditions that turned skin to leather. Oddman monitored the stove. At the 14th hour, the fire began to overfire. The intake, freshly cleared, was feeding too much air. The iron collar around the stovepipe joint glowed dull red, visible in the darkened room like a warning written in heat. "Close the gate," Oddman said. "1 finger width, not all the way." Marit slid the iron gate inward. The glow faded. The flame dropped from white-yellow to yellow-orange. The draw steadied. "If I close it too much?" Marit asked. "The fire starves. Smoke fills the room. With 6 children, you have maybe 10 minutes before the smallest ones cannot breathe. If I leave it open?" The collar heats past what the iron can hold. The stovepipe joint cracks. Fire reaches the sod roof. He paused. "You have less time for that." Marit stood by the gate for an hour, adjusting it by fractions, learning the relationship between wind, pipe flow, fire behavior, and the color of the iron collar. It was not an on-off system. It was an instrument. She was learning to play it while the storm played the cabin. At the 20th hour, Alma Kittredge came. She did not knock. She fell through the door. She had crawled from her cabin 200 yards south, following the fence line by touch, because her stove was smoking so badly her children could not breathe. Her husband was still somewhere between Morrow Crossing and Huron. She was alone with 4 children in a cabin that was slowly filling with smoke because she had sealed every crack against the wind and the stove had no air to burn. Alma lay on the floor of Marit's cabin, gasping, snow in her hair and her eyelashes frozen shut. Marit gave her water. Oddman pulled off her boots and checked her feet for frostbite. The children made room on the bed without being told. When Alma could breathe again, she looked around the room. 6 children on the bed, blankets piled, stove burning steady, no smoke, no floor draft cutting through the room like a river. "It is not pulling from the room," Alma whispered. "No," Marit said. "It is not." Alma closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "I left my children in the cabin. Thomas is with them. He is 13. He knows how to manage a damper, but the smoke... We will get them when the wind drops. If the wind drops. It will drop." It dropped at 1 a.m. on January 13th. Not fully. The wind continued, but the whiteout eased enough to see the barn. Marit and Thomas went to Alma's cabin and brought the 4 Kittredge children back, wrapped in quilts, and carried through snow that came up to Thomas's waist. Marit's cabin now held 10 children and 3 adults. The stove held. The pipe held. The gate stayed where Marit had learned to set it. The wood consumption through the 31-hour storm was less than half a cord, a fraction of what Rufus had predicted for a gale of that severity. By dawn on the 13th, the storm was dying. The wind still cut, but the sky had cleared enough to show the damage. Snow was piled to the eaves on the north side of every building. The section road had disappeared. A drift 12 feet high blocked the path between Marit's cabin and the barn. The first news came from Morrow Crossing. Rufus Calder's cabin had held, but his wife had stuffed quilts against every crack, and the stove smoked for 9 hours. His fingertips were frostbitten from trying to clear snow from his chimney cap on the roof. Burton Pike's hired man, Len Bostwick, the freight driver who had laughed at Dirt Chimney in the woodyard, had tried to cross from the woodyard to the livery during the storm. They found him against a hayrack 30 feet from the livery door. He was alive, barely. His left foot would not recover. A settler named Dahl, father of the 2 children Thomas had brought to Marit's door, had left his cabin to fetch wood from an outbuilding during the storm. His wife found his mitten above the snow the next morning, stiff and frozen, 20 yards from the door. His lantern was still burning under a crusted globe of ice a few feet further on. He had died standing up, in a drift that rose around him faster than he could move. Marit heard the news and said nothing. She fed the stove. She fed the children. She greased her torn hand and wrapped it in clean cloth. She checked the intake screen, which was crusted with ice but still drawing. The first person at her door after the storm was not a grateful neighbor. It was Burton Pike. He stood in the yard, snow to his knees, looking at the smoke rising from Marit's chimney. His face showed something Marit had not seen on it before. Not anger, not mockery, but the particular expression of a man who has calculated an outcome and been wrong. He looked at the chimney smoke. He looked at the woodpile, which still had nearly 4 cords stacked against the wall. He looked at the cabin, which had held 10 children and 3 adults through a 31-hour blizzard without a single hour of uncontrolled smoke. He did not speak. He turned and walked back toward the section road, his boots punching through the crust with every step. Marit watched him go. She did not feel triumph. She felt the torn skin on her hand and the ache in her shoulders, and the weight of 10 sleeping children on a bed built for 3. She felt the cold that was still in the floor because no buried pipe on the Dakota prairie could eliminate cold entirely. She felt the sound of the stove drawing, steady and even, the air moving through its road beneath the ground, and she felt Eli's forehead against her palm. The cough had not come back since midnight. For the first time in weeks, her daughter's breathing was even, unhurried, the rhythm of a child who was simply sleeping. Marit closed her eyes. The stove drew. The wind pressed. The pipe held. It was not over. Nothing on the prairie was ever over. But the thing buried in the dirt, the thing they had laughed at, the thing Rufus had called impossible and Pike had called a flower pot joke, had kept 6 children alive through the worst night of the worst winter anyone in Morrow Crossing could remember. And Burton Pike had seen the smoke, and he had no answer for it. The storm left Morrow Crossing buried under 4 feet of packed snow, 1 man dead, another crippled, and a question no one had thought to ask before January 12th. Why had the Brecky cabin held 10 children through the night while larger, better-built homes filled with smoke? The answer traveled the way the dirt chimney joke had traveled, through every kitchen, every woodyard conversation, every woman leaning across a fence line. But it traveled differently now. The joke had moved with laughter. The answer moved with need. Rufus Calder arrived 3 days after the storm. He did not ride. His mare had thrown a shoe in the drift, and he walked the 2 miles from Morrow Crossing with his toolbox on his back, his frostbitten fingers wrapped in cotton batting, and his pride tucked somewhere beneath both. He did not knock. He pushed the door open the way he had the first time. But he did not stand in the center of the room with his arms crossed. He walked to the stove. He crouched. He put his good hand on the floor near the ash grate and held it there. "No draft," he said. Not a question. "The pipe is feeding from below," Marit said. She was at the table, mending Eli's boot sole with an awl and a strip of leather. The children were outside for the first time in 4 days, building a fort from the drift that had buried the north wall. "Show me." Marit set down the boot. She opened the sliding gate 1 finger width wider. The fire brightened. Rufus held his hand near the floor crack by the door, the same crack where, 3 months earlier, the candle flame had bent hard toward the stove. "I feel air moving," Rufus said. But it is not coming from outside. It is coming from outside. It is coming through 72 feet of clay tile, 2 feet underground, where the earth warms it before it reaches the firebox. Rufus stood. He checked the ash door. He checked the stovepipe joint. He checked the iron collar where the intake box connected to the grate. He tapped the floor with his knuckle, listening for the hollow sound of the pipe running beneath. Then he did something Marit did not expect. He pulled his coat off, lay down on the floor, and pressed his ear to the boards. "I can hear it," he said. "Drawing. Like water in a pipe, but air." He stood and brushed the dust from his shirt. He looked at Marit with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not admiration, exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who has spent 58 years building things one way and has just been shown that he missed something. "I was wrong about the direction," Rufus said. "Your chimney still goes up. You only gave the fire a road before it got there." He said it plainly, without apology and without warmth. Rufus was not a man who softened his errors any more than he softened his judgments. But he said it, and he said it looking at Marit, and that was enough. "How much wood did you burn in the Gale?" he asked. "Less than half a cord. 31 hours. Rufus did the arithmetic in his head. His lips moved. "I burned 1.25 in my cabin. Smaller room, 2 adults. No children except the ones my wife took in from the Groberg place, and my stove smoked for 9 hours because she sealed the cracks." He put his coat back on. At the door he turned. "I will send lumber scraps for intake hoods. Anyone who builds one of these will need a proper cover on the outside end." "They will need more than a cover," Marit said. "They will need to understand why it works." "Then teach them," Rufus said. "I will build the hoods." He left. The door closed. The stove drew, steady and even. The questions began within the week, not from everyone, not from Pike's corner of the settlement, but from the people who had spent 31 hours listening to their own stoves fight them. Alma Kittredge came first. She did not come with questions. She came with measurements. Her cabin was 18 by 22. Her stove was a number 7 box, smaller than Marit's. She had already paced the distance from her woodshed to the cabin wall, 61 feet. She brought a pencil and a piece of brown paper torn from a flour sack. "Show me," Alma said. Marit did not draw for her. She walked Alma through the system. They started at the woodshed intake, the slanted plank hood, the wire mesh, the burlap flap. Marit lifted the flap and Alma put her hand inside the pipe mouth. "I feel it pulling," Alma said. "That is the stove, 60 feet away, asking for air. The pipe gives it a road." They walked the trench line. Marit showed her the gravel sump, the clean-out cover, the shoring boards. She explained slope, 2 inches of fall over the full run, enough for condensation to drain, not enough to create turbulence. She explained joint sealing, puddled clay and chopped straw, pressed around the bell, lower lip left open for drainage. Inside the cabin, she showed Alma the intake box, the sliding gate, the clay collar. She opened the gate and closed it while Alma watched the flame respond. "The gate is the heart of it," Marit said. "Too wide and the fire overfires. The collar glows. Too narrow and the fire starves. Smoke fills the room. You must learn the colors." "What colors?" "Yellow is right. Blue at the base means too much air. Dark orange means too little. You will learn them in a day." Alma wrote everything down. At the door she stopped. She did not look at Marit when she said it. "During the storm, when I crawled to your cabin, I left 4 children in a room full of smoke. My youngest could not stop coughing. I sealed every crack because I thought tight was warm. Tight was not warm. Tight was smoke." She paused. "I will not ask my children to breathe that way again." This was Alma's conversion. It did not come as praise. It came as a mother's reckoning with what she had almost done. Others followed. Eric Dahl's widow, the woman whose husband had died in the drift, came with her brother-in-law. She did not speak much. She held her hands together and watched while Marit explained the system. Her brother-in-law asked about pipe sources and cost. Marit told him about the rejected tile at the freight depot and the scrap iron at Pike's yard. A man named Thorkel Lund, who farmed 3 sections north, brought his grown son and a tape measure. He had not spoken to Marit before. He did not apologize for the mockery. He said, "My stove ate 2 cords in that storm. My wife says you burned half a cord. I want to know how." Marit showed him the candle test. She lit a candle and held it near the floor crack by the door. The flame trembled but did not lean. Then she closed the sliding gate. Within 30 seconds, the flame began to pull, bending toward the stove as the firebox searched for air through the only paths left open, the cracks in the walls. "That," Marit said, pointing at the bent flame, "is what every stove in Morrow Crossing did during the storm. The fire pulls air from the room. The room pulls air from outside. The floor becomes a river of cold. The harder you burn, the more cold you invite." She opened the gate. The flame straightened. Thorkel Lunde watched it the way a man watches a card trick he cannot explain, not with wonder, but with the irritation of someone who feels he should have seen it himself. "Why does burying the pipe matter?" he asked. "Why not just run a piece of stovepipe through the wall near the floor?" "3 reasons," Marit said. "A pipe through the wall freezes. The air inside it is the same temperature as outside, 30 below, 40 below. That air hits the firebox cold and the stove works harder. A buried pipe runs through earth that stays warmer than the air. By the time the air reaches the stove, it has gained 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees. Second, a pipe through the wall can pack with snow from outside. A buried pipe with a screened intake in a sheltered shed does not face the wind directly. Third, a pipe through the wall is another hole in your cabin. A buried pipe leaves the walls intact. Thorkel Lund wrote none of this down. He turned to his son and said, "Dig the trench tomorrow." "Not yet," Marit said. "First you learn the tests, then you learn the failures, then you dig." Oddmund had taught her that. She was beginning to understand why. Pike tried to reframe the story before it finished being told. Within 2 weeks of the storm, Pike was telling customers at his woodyard that Marit had survived because her cabin sat in a low spot where the wind passed over, and because Oddmund Vangen, a professional tile man, had done the real work. "Any woman can dig a ditch if a man tells her where to point the shovel," Pike said. He said it to men who had not been inside Marit's cabin and had no way to check. He also began selling what he called Pike Winter Pipe Kits, 4 sections of clay tile, a tin elbow, and a piece of written instruction that told buyers to connect the pipe to the ash grate and seal everything tight. The kit cost $6. It did not include a sliding gate. It did not include a cleanout. It did not mention slope, condensation drainage, gravel sumps, or the danger of overfiring. Marit heard about the kits from Alma. She walked to Morrow Crossing the next day. She did not go to Pike's yard. She went to the general store, where 4 men were drinking coffee and discussing whether the Brecky pipe system was worth the labor. She asked if any of them had bought Pike's kit. One man had. He said he planned to install it that weekend. "May I see the instructions?" Marit asked. He showed her. She read them standing at the counter, her face still, her torn hand wrapped in clean cotton. When she finished, she set the paper down. "These instructions will burn your cabin," she said. "There is no gate. There is no cleanout. There is no slope. And the instruction says to seal every joint completely. If you seal every joint and give the stove an uncontrolled air supply, the firebox will overfire and the collar will heat past what the iron can hold. If you then have a blocked pipe and no cleanout to clear it, the stove will backdraft smoke into a sealed room." The man looked at the paper. He looked at Marit. He said, "Pike said you would say that." "Pike has never laid a tile in his life," Marit said. "Pike sells cordwood. A stove that draws less air burns less wood. Think about who benefits from a system that fails." She left the store. She did not know if the man would listen, but she had said it where others could hear. Oddman and Marit spent February building. Not alone, Rufus sent lumber scraps as promised, and Alma's boy Thomas hauled tile from the depot on a borrowed sled. But the core work was theirs. They fitted Alma's cabin first. Smaller stove, shorter run, simpler layout. Oddman insisted that Alma learn every step, every test, every failure mode. He made her diagnose staged problems: a screen packed with lint, a joint left deliberately loose, a gate opened too wide. If she cannot find the fault, she cannot fix the fault, Oddman told Marit. And if she cannot fix the fault, the system belongs to you instead of to her. A system that belongs to someone else is a system that kills when you are not there. Alma passed every test. She installed her own clean-out rod. She marked her own gate positions: safe winter burn, kindling draft, banking overnight, with scratches filed into the iron. They moved to Thorkel Lund's cabin next. Longer run, different soil, a rock shelf that required the pipe to jog sideways. Oddman showed Marit how to handle the offset: two 45-degree elbows instead of a single 90, because sharp angles catch debris and slow airflow. Lunda's son did the digging. Marit did the bedding and sealing. Oddman checked every joint from a chair they carried to the trench edge because his leg was worsening in the cold. By the end of February, 3 cabins had dedicated air paths. By mid-March, 2 more were underway. The work was slow because the ground was still frozen and because Marit refused to let anyone skip the testing. Every household that received the system had to demonstrate the candle test, the gate adjustment, the clean-out procedure, and the overfire response. "You are slowing everything down," Thorkel Lunde told her. "My son can dig faster than you can teach." "Your son can also burn faster than he can learn," Marit said. "The pipe is not the system. The person who runs the pipe is the system." Oddman, sitting in his chair by the trench, tapped his cane on the frozen ground. "Listen to her," he said. "She sounds like me. That means she's right." It was the closest thing to a joke Marit had heard him make. She laughed. Eli, watching from the cabin door, laughed because her mother laughed. Oddman's cough started in late March. It was not Eli's cough, not the dry, barking thing that came from cold air and floor drafts. This was wet, deep. The sound of something heavy settling in a chest that had spent too many winters breathing dust and damp air in trenches and dugouts. He dismissed it. He had dismissed worse. His leg had been dismissed for 8 years. A cough was nothing compared to a leg that did not bend, but the cough did not stop. It deepened through the first week of April. Oddman still came to check installations, still tapped tiles, still argued about slope. He argued from a sitting position more often now. His face had the color of old candle wax. On an afternoon in mid-April, a cold rain moved through. Not a storm, just a steady, soaking rain that turned the thawing ground to mud and sent meltwater into every low spot on the prairie. Oddman was helping Marit repair a flooded intake at the Dahl cabin. The pipe had taken water through a joint that had cracked during the spring thaw, exactly the kind of failure Oddman had been predicting since the first thaw in November. He knelt in the mud to inspect the joint. The rain ran down his hat brim and soaked his coat. He stayed in the mud for 20 minutes, working the cracked tile free with his hands, his stiff leg buried to the knee. That night, the cough turned to fever. Marit brought broth. Oddman drank it sitting in his dugout, which smelled of goat and damp sod and the mineral sharpness of a man who had spent his life close to the earth. His 3 goats watched from the corner with the patience of animals who have seen everything. "The Dahl joint needs a sleeve," Oddman said. His voice was a ruin, thick, broken, each word costing breath he did not have enough of. A clay collar over the crack, packed with straw paste, then a second tile section set over the top. The sleeve takes the frost heave. The inner joint stays dry. "I know how to sleeve a joint," Marit said. "You know how I sleeve a joint. That is not the same." He coughed. The cough bent him forward. When he straightened, there was blood on his lip. He wiped it with the back of his hand and looked at the smear the way he looked at everything, analytically, without sentiment. "The blood is from the lung, not the throat. The lung means I'm not getting better." "You are getting better." "I'm getting honest. There's a difference." He tapped the floor with his cane. 2 short taps, then a long one, the rhythm he used to mark slope in a trench. "Do not let them make it simple, Marit." Simple things kill when men stop thinking. He reached beside his bed and picked up his tile hammer, a short-handled tool with a flat face on one side and a chisel edge on the other, worn smooth from 30 years of cutting clay. He held it out. "I do not want your hammer," Marit said. "I am not giving you my hammer. I am giving you a problem. If you keep the hammer, you must keep the standard. Every tile bedded level, every joint sealed right, every person taught to find the fault before the fault finds them." Marit took the hammer. It was heavier than it looked. The handle was dark with oil and grip marks that fit a hand larger than hers. Odmund died on the 23rd of April, 1888. The lung fever took him in his sleep, which was the only gentle thing about it. Marit found him in the morning when she came with broth. The goats were standing close to the bed, as if warmth could still matter. She buried him on the south side of his dugout, next to a patch of ground where he had been trying to grow onions. Rufus Calder dug the grave. Alma brought food. 12 people from Morrow Crossing attended, including 4 whose cabins now had buried air pipes. No one said anything about the dirt chimney. That phrase had died somewhere in the winter, replaced by a quieter vocabulary. Air road, intake pipe, brecca stove, names that carried function instead of mockery. Marit did not cry at the burial. She stood with Odmund's tile hammer in her coat pocket, her hand wrapped around the handle, and listened to Rufus read a passage from a Norwegian Bible that Odmund had kept beside his bed. She did not cry because Odmund would not have wanted it, and because she had learned from him that grief, like water and smoke and air, takes the road you give it. She gave it work. The secondary crisis came 6 weeks later on a Sunday evening in early June when the weather should have been past the point of killing. The Morrow Crossing schoolhouse doubled as a church on Sundays, and a church supper had gathered 32 people, families, children, the schoolteacher, Rufus Calder, and his wife, into a single room heated by a cast-iron box stove that was adequate for a classroom of 12, but not designed for a crowd that filled every bench and stood along the walls. The evening had been mild when the supper started. By 8 o'clock, a late spring storm had moved in from the northwest. Not a blizzard, not a gale, but a hard wind carrying cold rain that turned to sleet by 9. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. People who had come without heavy coats were not going home until the storm passed. Someone sealed the schoolhouse windows. Someone else stuffed rags under the door. The stove was loaded with wood from the bin in the corner, and the room grew warm at shoulder height and cold at the floor, and within an hour the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, lamp oil, and the first threads of smoke that curled from the stove's lid seams. The stove was smoking because it could not breathe. 32 people in a sealed room had consumed the available oxygen faster than the cracks in the walls could replace it. The stove, starved for air, was losing its upward draft. Smoke that should have gone up the chimney was leaking sideways, filling the room from the ceiling down. Children began coughing. The school teacher, a woman named Ingeborg Flatten, opened a window. Sleet blew in sideways. She closed it. The smoke thickened. Rufus Calder tried adjusting the damper. Open, the stove pulled harder, but the smoke increased because the firebox could not get enough air to burn clean. Closed, the fire died, and the room began to cool. In an hour, with the storm still pressing outside, the room temperature would drop below what the children could endure. Marit had been sitting in the back row with Eli and Amos when the smoke started. She watched the stove. She watched the ceiling, where a gray layer was thickening like fog rolling in. She watched Rufus work the damper and fail. Odmund was gone. Rufus was here but did not know what she knew. There was no buried pipe, no time to dig one, no clay tile, no iron box. There was only the principle. Give the fire its own road. She stood up and walked to the stove. Rufus stepped back. Every face in the room turned toward her. "I need a stovepipe section," she said. "Any short length, even a foot. And I need someone to pull one board loose from the wall on the lee side, the south wall, where the wind is not hitting directly." Thorkel Lund's son had a 2-foot section of stovepipe in his wagon. He had been hauling it for a repair on his own cabin. He brought it in, sleet running from his hat. Rufus pulled a lower board loose from the south wall with his claw hammer. Cold air flooded through the gap, but Marit told him to wait. She fitted the stovepipe through the opening, angled slightly downward so rain would not run inside. The outer end sat 6 inches beyond the wall. The inner end pointed toward the stove's ash grate. "I need something to close the gap around the pipe," Marit said. "Cloth, rags, anything." Women pulled scarves and handkerchiefs from pockets. Marit packed the fabric around the stovepipe where it passed through the wall, sealing the gap tight enough to stop the sleet, but leaving the pipe bore open. The last piece was the gate. She did not have a sliding iron plate. She had a biscuit tin. She flattened the lid, bent it into a curve that fit over the stovepipe's inner mouth, and wedged it so she could slide it open or closed with one hand. The entire assembly took 9 minutes. It was crude. It was ugly. It was not buried in the ground or tempered by earth or fitted with a clean-out or screened against mice. But when she opened the biscuit tin gate, the stove's behavior changed. The fire, which had been starving and smoking, found air. Fresh, cold air, pulled through the pipe from outside, delivered directly to the firebox without crossing the room. The smoke at the ceiling began to thin. The stove's draw strengthened. The lid seams stopped leaking. Rufus Calder stood by the stove and watched the flame change color, from the dark, angry orange of a starved fire to the steady yellow of one that had what it needed. "Same principle," he said. "Same principle," Marit said. "The fire does not care if the road is clay tile under the ground or stovepipe through a wall. It cares that it has a road. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it." Because Marit's lesson was never only about one stove. It was about learning the hidden path danger used to enter a home. The schoolhouse held through the storm. The stove burned clean. The smoke cleared. 32 people sat in a room that was warm at the floor and warm at the ceiling because the fire was no longer eating the air they needed to breathe. Ingeborg Flatten, the school teacher, sat beside Marit after the worst of the sleet had passed and the children were sleeping on the benches. "How did you know to do that?" she asked. "A man named Oddmund Vangen taught me that air takes the road you give it. He learned it laying culverts. I learned it burying pipe. You learned it tonight watching a stove smoke." "Can you teach it to my students?" Marit looked at her. Ingeborg was serious. She had spent the evening watching children choke on smoke in a room that should have been safe, and she wanted to know why. "Yes," Marit said. "I can teach it." Pike's response to the schoolhouse incident was predictable and swift. Within 3 days, he was telling anyone who would listen that Marit Brecke had punched a hole in the schoolhouse wall, endangered the building's structure, and created a fire hazard by running stovepipe through dry lumber. He found 2 men who were willing to stand by his claim. Neither had been at the supper. Both owed Pike money. Pike framed the argument carefully. He did not attack the buried pipe system directly. That battle had been lost on the night of January 12th. He attacked Marit's authority. Who had given a widow with no builder's training the right to modify public buildings? What happened when someone copied her method badly and a cabin burned? Who would be responsible? The accusation was credible because it contained a real truth. The system could be dangerous if copied without understanding. Oddmund had known this. Marit knew it. Pike's own shoddy kits, which were still being sold, though now with fewer buyers, proved the point. A bad copy of a good idea was worse than no copy at all. Marit heard about Pike's campaign from Rufus, who told her bluntly, "He's not wrong that a fool can burn a house with your system. He is wrong that the answer is to stop teaching it." "The answer is to teach it better," Marit said. "Then teach it publicly, at the township meeting, in front of Pike, in front of everyone. Let them see the system and the tests and the failures. Let them decide." Marit agreed. The township meeting was set for the last week of June. Pike would bring his evidence. Marit would bring hers. She spent the 3 weeks before the meeting building something Oddmund would have insisted on: a demonstration rig, a short section of pipe, 6 tiles, an intake, a gate, and a clean-out, laid out on a raised platform so people could see the connections without crawling on the ground. She built it with Eli's help, the 8-year-old handing tiles and holding the candle during test runs. On the platform's edge, she set Oddman's tile hammer, not as a memorial, as a standard. The meeting was coming. Pike was coming. Every person in Morrow Crossing who had an opinion about buried pipes, dirt chimneys, air roads, and widows who would not stop digging was coming. Marit was ready. She had been ready since the moment the stove first gulped in the dark, and she had heard, in its hunger, a question no one else had thought to ask. Where does the fire get its air? She had the answer. Now she had to make it survive the man who sold the question. The township meeting was held in the schoolhouse on a Thursday evening at the end of June, 1888. Every bench was full. Men stood against the walls. Women sat in the back rows with children on their laps. The air smelled of tobacco, lamp oil, and the particular tension of a community about to argue in public about something that mattered. Burton Pike sat in the front row with a burlap sack between his boots. Inside the sack was a warped stove collar, blackened, bent outward, the iron stretched and discolored from heat that had exceeded what the metal could hold. He had brought it from a cabin 4 miles south, where a hired man had installed one of Pike's own kits without a sliding gate and without a cleanout, exactly as the instructions specified. The collar had overheated. The stovepipe joint had cracked. Smoke had filled the cabin. The hired man had pulled the pipe out of the wall and doused the stove with a bucket of water, cracking the firebox plate. No one had been hurt, but the evidence was ugly. Pike was not stupid. He knew his own kit had caused the failure. But the kit was not what he planned to discuss. The kit was a prop. What he planned to discuss was the principle, and the woman who had spread it. Rufus Calder called the meeting to order. He was not the township chair, but the township chair, a man named Elling Solheim, had asked him to run the discussion because Rufus was the only person in the room both skeptics and believers trusted. Pike stood first. He held up the warped collar. This, Pike said, came from Nels Hagen's cabin. Hagen's man installed an air pipe to the stove. The pipe overfired the stove, the collar warped, the joint cracked. If Hagen had not been home, the cabin would have burned. He set the collar on the table. It sat there like a piece of evidence at a trial, which was exactly what Pike intended. Mrs. Brecka has been teaching people to run pipes to their stoves, Pike continued. She has been telling them it saves wood and keeps floors warm. Maybe it does. But it also creates a fire risk that no one in this room can control. A buried pipe feeding uncontrolled air to a firebox is a danger to every cabin it is attached to and every cabin beside it. If one house burns, the prairie takes the rest. He paused. He was good at pausing. He had the voice and the timing of a man who sold things for a living, and what he was selling now was fear. I'm not saying the idea is wrong, Pike said. I'm saying the idea without proper control is dangerous. And I'm asking who in this room has the training, the authority, and the responsibility to decide what is safe and what is not. He sat down. The room was quiet. The question hung, not about pipes, but about Marit, about whether a widow who dug trenches and laid tile had the right to teach others to do the same. Marit stood. She did not walk to the front. She spoke from where she was, in the 4th row, with Eli beside her. Mr. Pike, she said, who installed the pipe in Nels Hagen's cabin? Pike frowned. Hagen's hired man. Using what instructions? The room shifted. People who had bought Pike's kits knew where this was going. Pike said, the man had general knowledge of stove fitting. He had your kit, Marit said. 4 tiles, a tin elbow, and a piece of paper that says to seal every joint and connect the pipe to the ash grate. No gate, no cleanout, no slope instruction, no warning about overfire. She reached into her coat and produced a folded sheet, Pike's own instruction page, bought from a man who had returned the kit after the storm. She unfolded it and held it up. This paper tells a man to give his stove unlimited air, with no way to control it and no way to clear a blockage. It does not mention that a wide-open air feed can heat a collar past what iron will hold. It does not mention that a sealed joint with no drainage will crack in the first thaw. It does not mention that a blocked pipe with no cleanout will reverse the draft and fill a cabin with smoke. She set the paper on the table next to the warped collar. The danger is not the idea, Mr. Pike. The danger is copying without understanding, and the evidence on this table is yours, not mine. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Then Rufus Calder, who had been standing against the wall with his arms folded, walked to the table. He picked up the warped collar. He turned it in his hands. "I have seen Mrs. Brecka's installation," Rufus said. "I have checked the joints, the gate, the clean-out, and the collar. In the storm of January 12th, that system held 10 children for 31 hours without smoke, without overfire, and with less than half a cord of wood burned. I've also seen Mrs. Brecka refuse to let anyone install the system until they can demonstrate the candle test, the gate adjustment, and the clean-out procedure." He set the collar down. "And I have seen this," he said, tapping Pike's instruction sheet. 4 tiles and no brain. That is not Mrs. Brecka's system. That is a shortcut sold for $6 by a man who has never laid a tile in his life." Pike's face darkened. "I am not the one on trial here, Calder." "No one is on trial," Rufus said. "But if someone were, the evidence would point at your woodyard, not at the Brecka cabin." Alma Kittredge spoke next. She did not stand. She spoke from the bench with her youngest child asleep against her shoulder. "During the January storm, my cabin filled with smoke because I sealed every crack and my stove had no air to burn," Alma said. "I crawled 200 yards through a blizzard to Mrs. Brecka's cabin because I could not breathe in my own home. My children could not breathe. When I reached her cabin, 10 children were sleeping on the bed. The stove was burning clean. The floor was not frozen. The difference was a buried pipe and a woman who understood how to use it." She paused. The child shifted against her shoulder. "My cabin has that pipe now. My children sleep through the wind. I do not crawl anymore." "If Mr. Pike wants to call that dangerous, he can come crawl through my floor draft first." Ingeborg Flatten, the schoolteacher, stood. She described the church supper, the smoke filling the schoolhouse, the children coughing, the stove dying. She described Marit's 9-minute solution. She described the room clearing, the stove drawing clean, 32 people surviving a storm in a building that had been choking them. "I have asked Mrs. Brecka to teach my students why stoves need air and where that air should come from," Ingeborg said. "If this meeting decides that is dangerous, then ignorance is the alternative. And I watched ignorance fill a room with smoke while children coughed." 3 voices: authority, mother, educator, each speaking from a different position in the community, each saying the same thing in different words. The system worked, the understanding mattered, and the person who taught it had earned the right to teach. Pike did not speak again during the meeting. He sat in the front row with the warped collar and his instruction sheet on the table in front of him, and the meeting moved on to questions. Practical questions, from men and women who wanted to know about pipe depth and gate width, and what to do when the ground thawed and the joints shifted. Marit answered every question from the demonstration rig she had built. She showed the connections. She lit a candle and demonstrated the draft. She opened the gate too wide and showed the flame turn blue at the base. She closed it too far and showed the smoke feather from the joint. She had Eli hand her the clean-out rod, and she pushed it through the pipe section while the room watched. At the end of the evening, Rufus asked for a show of hands. Who wanted to learn the system? 23 hands went up. Who wanted to learn it from Marit? The same 23 hands. Pike left before the count. He did not take the warped collar. It sat on the table for a week before someone used it as a doorstop at the general store. The summer and fall of 1888 were the season of trenches. Marit taught in groups of 3 or 4, working one cabin at a time, moving through the settlement like a circuit preacher with a tile hammer instead of a Bible. Each installation took 5 to 8 days, depending on distance, soil, and the skill of the household doing the digging. Marit did not dig. She taught digging. She taught bedding, sealing, sloping, draining, gating, cleaning, and testing. She taught the candle test until it became as routine as checking a damper. By the end of September, 12 cabins had some form of dedicated stove intake. Not all were buried clay tile. Two households used boxed wooden ducts lined with tin scraps. One used a short covered trench banked with sod, leading to a stone and iron intake box built by a blacksmith from Huron who had heard about the system from a freight driver. The variations mattered less than the principle. Every installation answered the same question: where does the fire get its air? Mart kept a slate list of failures alongside the successes: a cracked joint at the Groberg cabin that let groundwater into the pipe during a heavy rain, a mouse nest that blocked Thorkel Loon's intake for 3 days before his wife noticed the flame change color, a gate that rusted shut at Alma's cabin because the iron had not been greased. Each failure became a lesson, and each lesson became part of the teaching. Oddmund's tile hammer went with her to every site. She used it to tap tiles, test joints, and demonstrate what a cracked pipe sounded like versus a solid one, the dead thud of a fracture compared to the clean ring of intact clay. When students asked where she had learned to listen to tile, she told them about a man with a stiff leg who had laid culverts for the railroad and had recognized in a widow's trench a plan instead of a mistake. She did not sentimentalize Oddmund. She kept his standard: every tile bedded level, every joint sealed right, every person taught to find the fault before the fault found them. Bernd Haugland had been in the periphery of the story since the storm. He was 36, a widowed teamster and school board clerk who had lost his wife to scarlet fever 2 years earlier and was raising a son, Petter, age 7, in a sod cabin 3 miles west of Morrow Crossing. He was quiet in the way that large men are sometimes quiet, not shy, not withdrawn, but conserving energy for things that mattered. He had appeared after the January blizzard, hauling tile from the depot to Marit's cabin on his freight wagon without being asked. He had said, "Vanjan mentioned the tile was heavy. My wagon was empty." He had not stayed for coffee. He had not lingered. He had unloaded 29 tiles, touched his hat, and driven away. He appeared again in March, hauling lumber scraps from Rufus Calder's shop to the Kittredge installation. Again the wagon was conveniently empty. Again he did not stay. In May, after Oddmund's death, he appeared at the graveside. He had not known Oddmund well. He stood at the back and left before the group dispersed. In July, during the teaching season, he brought his son Peter to one of Marit's demonstrations at the Lunde cabin. Peter was the same age as Amos. The two boys stood together at the edge of the trench and watched Marit seal a joint. Bernd did not ask about the pipe. He asked about the slate. "You keep a list of failures," he said. He had been reading the slate, which Marit kept propped against the demonstration rig. "Every failure teaches something," Marit said. "Most people keep a list of what they built. You keep a list of what broke. What broke tells you what to fix. What you built only tells you what you hoped." Bernd looked at her. It was a look that contained more assessment than admiration, the look of a man who was measuring something and finding it larger than expected. "My cabin has a number 6 stove and a floor draft that keeps Peter awake," he said. "Can you teach me the system?" "I can teach you the principle. The system you build yourself." He came the next week with his son, a tape measure, and a willingness to learn that did not require his pride to die first. He dug his own trench. He bedded his own tile. Marit corrected his slope twice, his joint sealing once, and his gate position 3 times. She did not soften the corrections. He did not bristle at them. On the 4th day of the installation, while Marit was checking the cleanout and Bernd was fitting the intake hood, he said, "Peter sleeps better when Amos is here." "Amos sleeps better when Peter is here," Marit said. She did not look up from the cleanout. "My cabin is large enough for 2 families, if both families are small." Now she looked up. Bernd was holding the intake hood with both hands. His face was the color of a man who had just said something he had been thinking about for a longer time than the sentence suggested. "That is a practical observation," Marit said. "I am a practical man." "You are also holding the hood at the wrong angle. Tilt it 15 degrees south, or the snow will pack the mesh." He tilted the hood. She checked the cleanout. They did not discuss it again for 2 weeks. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through work. Bernd built a tile rack for Marit's teaching demonstrations. A portable frame that held 6 tiles at the correct slope so students could see the bedding angle without lying in a trench. Marit corrected his slope marks, which were off by a quarter-inch. He accepted the correction. She accepted the rack. He brought his wagon on teaching days, hauling tile and tools from site to site. She rode beside him on the bench. The children sat in the back, Eli reading, Amos and Peter competing to see who could balance longest on a moving stack of clay pipe. One evening in late August, after a full day installing the system at the Grobear cabin, Bernd and Marit sat on the tailgate of the wagon while the children played in the stubble field. The sun was setting into the prairie in a way that turned the grass red and the sky the color of iron cooling. "I am not proposing because you need a man," Bernd said. "You have shown everyone in Morrow Crossing that you do not need a man." "Then why?" "Because Peter needs Amos. Because Amos needs Peter. Because I sleep better when I know someone in the next room understands what the fire is asking for." He paused. "And because you corrected my slope marks without flinching, which means you will correct everything else without flinching. And I would rather live with a woman who does that than a woman who does not." Marit looked at him. She looked at the children in the field. She looked at the setting sun, which was doing what the sun did, going down, whether she decided anything or not. "Ask me again when the first snow comes," she said. "If your pipe holds and your gate works and your clean-out is clear, then I will know you listened when I taught you." Bernd's pipe held. His gate worked. His clean-out was clear. He asked again on the first day of November, with snow on his hat and frost on the wagon seat. She said yes. They married in December 1888 in the schoolhouse, with Rufus Calder and Alma Kittredge as witnesses. Ingeborg Flatten brought a cake. Eli held the ring. Amos and Peter stood together in matching coats that Alma had sewn from a single bolt of gray wool. It was not a rescue. It was a partnership between two people who had each survived something alone and chose to survive the rest of it together. Pike's final reckoning came the following winter, and it arrived not with a confrontation, but with smoke. In early January of 1889, a cold snap drove the temperature to 28 below. Pike's office at the woodyard had a box stove and walls that he had sealed with tar paper and tin patches after the previous winter's blizzard. The sealing worked, the stove smoked, the same physics that had driven Marit to dig a trench, the same starvation of air, the same backdraft through lid seams, the same river of cold across the floor, filled Pike's office with smoke thick enough to drive him outside in his shirt sleeves. He sent for Rufus. Rufus came, looked at the stove, and said, "I can build you a hood, but you need the pipe, and the pipe means calling Mrs. Brecka." "I am not calling Mrs. Brecka." "Then you are breathing smoke until April." Pike breathed smoke for 3 days. On the 4th day, with his eyes swollen and his throat raw, he sent a boy to the Hogland cabin, the merged household where Marit and Bernd now lived with 4 children and a stove that burned clean. The boy delivered the message. Marit came that afternoon. She found Pike standing in his woodyard, arms crossed, looking at his office the way Rufus had once looked at Marit's cabin, with the expression of a man assessing a loss. "Mrs. Brecka," Pike said. He said it the way a man says a word he has practiced until the edges come off. "I need that dirt chimney looked at." Marit stood in the yard with Oddman's tile hammer in her coat pocket. She looked at Pike. She looked at the office. She looked at the wood stacked in his yard, cords and cords of it, more wood than any 10 families needed, the inventory of a man whose entire livelihood depended on stoves being hungry. "No," she said. "You do not need a dirt chimney. You need an air road. The dirt was only where we put it." She walked into his office. She checked the stove. She checked the walls. She found the problem in 4 minutes, the same problem every sealed cabin had, the same problem she had been solving for a year. The stove was starving. The room was its only air supply. The tar paper and tin that Pike had used to seal the walls had turned his office into a box that the stove was slowly emptying. She did not install a full buried pipe system. Pike's office was a small, single-room building with no crawl space and no adjacent shed. She installed what she had learned at the schoolhouse, a short stovepipe section through the lee wall, a screened intake, and a biscuit tin gate. Total cost, 40 cents in materials and 2 hours of labor. When she finished, the stove burned clean. The smoke cleared. Pike stood in his own office and breathed air that did not hurt. He did not thank her. He paid her 50 cents, a dime more than the materials, and said, "I will not be needing to sell as many winter kits." "No," Marit said, "you will not." She left. Pike watched her walk down the street toward Burnt's waiting wagon, the tile hammer visible in her coat pocket, the children waving from the wagon bed. He did not sell another winter kit. He did not mention the dirt chimney again. When men at his yard asked about the Brika system, he said, "Ask her. She knows more about it than I do." It was not generosity. It was the minimum acknowledgement of a man who had stood in his own smoke long enough to understand what he had been selling. The years compressed the way years do on the prairie, slowly at first, then all at once. By the winter of 1890, 17 cabins around Morrow Crossing had some form of dedicated stove intake or controlled combustion air path. Not all were Marit's design. A blacksmith in Huron had begun fabricating iron intake boxes with built-in gates, and a lumber dealer in Mitchell was selling pre-cut hood frames. The variations multiplied. The principle held. Marit and Burnt expanded the claim. They built a larger house in 1891, a proper frame house with a dedicated outside air chase built into the stone foundation, the way Odmund would have done it if he had built houses instead of culverts. The chase ran from a screened intake in the cellar wall to an iron box beneath the kitchen stove. It was not a trench in the dirt. It was architecture. Marit designed it. Rufus built it. Burnt hauled the stone. Eli grew. The cough faded as the floors warmed and the drafts died. She became a student of Ingeborg Flatten and then, in time, a teacher herself, first at the Morrow Crossing School, later at a larger school in Huron, where she taught geography and kept a cracked 6-inch clay tile on her desk as a paperweight. When students asked about it, she told them it was a piece of the first road her mother ever built. Amos grew into his father's build and his mother's precision. He apprenticed to a mason in Mitchell at 16 and spent his 20s building foundations across the eastern Dakota Territory. He specialized in cellar work, ventilation, drainage, the underground systems that kept a house alive. He never called it the Brecka system. He called it common sense, which was what it became. Peter, Burnt's son, became a freight hauler like his father. He married a woman from Huron and settled 2 sections north of the original claim. His cabin had a buried tile intake that he installed himself using the skills Marit had taught him at age 7, standing at the edge of a trench with Amos, watching his future stepmother seal a joint with clay and chopped straw. Marit never patented anything. The method spread the way methods spread on the prairie, through winter visits, church suppers, women leaning across fence lines, and men grudgingly copying what their wives had asked them to copy after one too many nights of floor draft in smoke-filled rooms. She kept Odmund's tile hammer by the kitchen door of the new house, where it served no practical purpose except to remind her of a man who had looked at her trench and seen a plan instead of a mistake. She kept a slate list of failures in the pantry. It grew longer every year. She considered this a sign of progress. Marit Brecka Haugland lived into the early 1900s, long enough to see manufactured stove parts with stamped-in air channels, long enough to see tighter houses with factory-built foundations, long enough to see her old trench, the 72 feet of clay tile that had kept 6 children alive on the night of January 12th, become a relic half buried in a yard where newer, straighter pipes ran through concrete and iron. She was 67 when she died, in the spring of 1903, in the house that Rufus had built and Burnt had filled with stone, and she had fitted with the air road that no one laughed at anymore. Burnt found her in the kitchen, sitting in the chair by the stove, her hand resting on the warm floorboard where the draft used to run. The stove was drawing. The fire was steady. The gate was set exactly where it should have been, on the table beside her, next to a cup of cold coffee and a pair of Eli's reading spectacles, sat Odmund's tile hammer. The handle was dark with 30 years of grip. The chisel edge was still sharp. Within 3 winters of the January blizzard, Marit's exact buried tile design was not everywhere, but her principle was. 17 cabins near Morro Crossing had dedicated air paths for their stoves, some through clay tile, some through boxed wooden ducts lined with tin, some through short covered trenches banked with sod. The important spread was not the object. It was the habit of asking where the fire gets its air. Marit lived out her later years on the same claim she nearly lost. She became known not as a widow who survived one gale, but as the woman people called before sealing a cabin too tight. In her kitchen, beside the stove that had outlasted 2 houses and 1 husband, she kept one cracked 6-inch clay tile as a doorstop. Visitors who noticed it rarely asked what it was. Those who did received a question in return. Do you know where your fire gets its air? On a night in January, any January, every January, when the north wind pressed snow flat against the same prairie where Rufus Calder had once told Marit Brecka that a chimney goes up and a dream goes nowhere, smoke still rose from the chimney. It rose straight and clean, the sign of a fire that had what it needed. But beneath the floor, where no one mocked anymore because no one could see it, the fire had another road, a road that ran through the dark earth, through clay laid by scarred hands, through joints sealed with straw and patience, through the ground that everyone else had only thought to walk on. The last image is the simplest. Marit's hand on the warm floorboard where the frost used to grow, where her children used to shiver, where the winter used to come inside and sit down beside the stove as if it had been invited. The chimney went up, but the thing that saved them had gone down first.